court-martialed him because they said he was lying, and he was dismissed from the academy.
While at West Point, Young has to learn how to navigate a color line with the other white cadets.
His experience at West Point was so intense, so severe, he once said the worst thing he could ever wish on an enemy would be to make them a cadet at West Point.
Young was the third black graduate of West Point in 1889, and he was the last black graduate until 1936, a period of almost 50 years.
Enlisted men like Moses Williams did not get a formal education like the kind Charles Young received at West Point. But the Army needed skilled clerks and assigned its regimental chaplains to attend to the soldiers' spiritual and educational needs.
Education opportunities were really limited for African American men at the time, and so the Army offered this opportunity.
With the encouragement of his regimental chaplain, Williams studies to become an ordnance sergeant, the officer in charge of arms and ammunition at an Army post.
Ordnance sergeants were not appointed lightly. It required appointment by the Secretary of War after recommendation from a board of officers.
Williams passes the test and becomes one of the first black ordnance sergeants in 1886. He then transfers to the 25th Infantry to take charge of the ordnance at Fort Buford in the Dakota Territory. It was a remarkable achievement for a man who could not read or write when he joined the Army. 3 years later, in 1889, Charles Young graduates from West Point. The racial barriers that he had overcome as a cadet would shape the rest of his career.
The Army was preoccupied with minimizing Young's contact with white troops and white officers. This meant that when he graduated from West Point, the Army had one choice: assign Charles Young to one of the 4 black regiments.
Lieutenant Young is assigned to the 9th Cavalry, Moses Williams' old unit, and posted to Fort Robinson, Nebraska.
The mission of the Army had changed on the Western frontier.
America's campaign to usurp indigenous lands was almost finished. Indigenous peoples had been forced onto reservations, like the Sioux Reservation north of Fort Robinson. And the U.S. Army was tasked with making sure they didn't leave.
And these larger posts like Fort Robinson were connected by railroad, by telegraph. The posts just weren't isolated like they had been in the former frontier time.